Eleanor Burrows had spent 61 years paying rent to other people, and when she finally found the vine-covered cottage in Crestwood, Kentucky, she signed the papers without ever setting foot inside it, because at 79 years old, she had waited long enough. She wired every dollar she had saved across 6 decades of early mornings and careful living, and for 4 days, she believed she had finally done it. Then the gardening crew arrived, pulled back the vines, and the front wall of the house came down. What they found underneath, it was not something any of them had expected. And what it would eventually mean for Eleanor Burrows was something none of them could have imagined standing in that garden on that quiet Tuesday morning in Crestwood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. There's a particular kind of hope that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with ceremony or insist on being noticed. It simply persists. It gets up in the morning alongside you and goes to work and comes home and sits quietly at the kitchen table while you do the math again. The same math you have been doing for years. The math of how much you have and how much you still need and how many more months it will take before the two numbers finally meet. Eleanor Burrows had lived with that kind of hope for so long that she had stopped being able to separate it from herself. It was not something she carried. It was something she was made of. She had been born in 1945 in a small house in Harlan County, Kentucky, the third of 5 children, in a family that rented because owning was not a thing people in their circumstances did, not because they lacked the desire for it, but because the economics of their lives did not leave room for it. Her father had worked in the mines, and her mother had kept the household running with the fierce efficiency of a woman who understood that efficiency was a form of love when money was short. Eleanor had grown up watching her mother make things stretch, and she had carried that watching into her own life the way children carry the things they absorb early, not as a lesson learned, but as a way of being. She had married Thomas Burrows in 1966, a quiet and steady man who worked for the county road department and who had, in Eleanor's estimation, the single most important quality a person could have, which was that he showed up. He showed up for work every day, and he showed up for her, and he showed up for their son Robert, who arrived in 1968 and who had Thomas's eyes and Eleanor's stubbornness in roughly equal measure. They had rented for the entirety of their marriage, moving 4 times in 31 years, each move driven by circumstances outside their control. A landlord who decided to sell, a building that was converted, a rent increase that outpaced what their combined income could absorb. Each time, they had packed everything they owned into boxes and found a new place and started again with the patient determination of people who had decided that this was a setback and not a defeat. Thomas had died in 1997, a Tuesday in November, of a heart attack that arrived without warning and took him the night before Eleanor had even understood what was happening. She had been 52 years old and had found herself, for the first time in 31 years, entirely alone in the management of her own life. Robert was 29 and living in Columbus by then, working in logistics, married to a woman named Dana, who was warm and competent and who called Eleanor every Sunday without fail, which was a kindness Eleanor had never taken for granted. But Sunday phone calls, however consistent and however loving, do not replace the presence of another person in the apartment in the evenings, and Eleanor had learned in the years after Thomas died what silence actually sounds like when it is not chosen. She had kept working. She had been a postal worker for 34 years, starting at 23 as a mail carrier on a route in Lexington that covered 3 neighborhoods and required walking 11 miles a day in all weather, and eventually moving into a supervisory role at the distribution center when her knees began to register their objections to the 11 miles. The work had given her structure and income and colleagues she was fond of and a sense of purpose that she recognized in the years after Thomas as something she needed more than she had previously understood. She had retired at 68, 5 years after her knees had made the supervisory role their final compromise with her body, and she had entered retirement with the orderly practicality she brought to everything, a budget reviewed monthly, expenses tracked in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, savings deposited on the same day every month without exception. The dream of the house had been there through all of it, through the moving and the loss and the years alone, through the careful accounting and the revised timelines, and the moments when a number she needed had seemed farther away than it had seemed the year before. It had been there in the same way the hope was there, not as a grand ambition she announced to the world, but as a steady and private understanding between herself and the future. One day, she would have a house that was hers. One day, she would pay a mortgage instead of rent, or better yet, she would pay it off entirely, and the roof over her head would belong to no one but her. No landlord could ask for it back. No sale could displace her. No lease could expire. The house would be hers, and it would stay hers for as long as she lived in it. She was 79 years old when the number finally arrived. It had taken longer than she had planned, longer than she had hoped, and there had been years when she had quietly revised her expectations downward, allowing herself to accept that perhaps it would not happen, that perhaps the apartment on the second floor of the building on Deering Avenue in Lexington, where she had lived for the past 11 years, was where she would finish her life. But she had not, even in those years, thrown away the folder. The folder was a legal-size manila envelope she kept in the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath the winter sweaters, and it contained 22 years of clipped photographs and torn magazine pages and printed real estate listings, houses she had found beautiful and imagined herself inside, houses with front porches and morning light windows and gardens she could tend in the way she had always wanted to tend a garden. The envelope was soft at the edges from handling. She had opened it and added to it and closed it again more times than she could count. She was not a sentimental woman by disposition. She was practical and unsentimental, and she did not collect things without purpose. But the envelope she kept. It was evidence of something she was not willing to relinquish, and on the evenings when the apartment felt most like a place she was waiting in rather than a place she was living in, she would take the envelope out and sit with it at the kitchen table, not looking at the photographs in any organized way, just holding the weight of them in her hands and letting the weight remind her that she had not stopped believing. That was enough. That had always been enough. If you know what it feels like to carry a dream so long it becomes a part of your breathing, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week on this channel, we bring you the stories that prove patience is never wasted. Now, let's begin. Eleanor Burrows had paid her first month's rent in September of 1966, the month she and Thomas moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the ground floor of a building on Callaway Street in Lexington, Kentucky. The apartment had a kitchen so narrow that two people could not stand side by side at the counter without their shoulders touching, and a bathroom with a shower head that ran cold for the first 90 seconds every morning regardless of what you did with the dial, and windows that faced the parking lot of a tire repair shop that opened at 6:30 and announced itself accordingly. The rent was $38 a month. On Thomas's salary from the county roads department and Eleanor's starting wage as a mail carrier, $38 felt like a significant portion of everything they had, and they paid it with the careful discipline of two people who understood that the roof over their heads was the first obligation and everything else was arranged around it. Thomas had carried the boxes in himself, refusing Eleanor's help with the heavier ones in the way he refused help with heavy things generally, which was quietly and without making a point of it. She had unpacked the kitchen while he assembled the bed frame, and by the time the sun went down on their first evening in the apartment, they had made it into something that felt, if not yet like home, then like the beginning of one. Eleanor had put a yellow dish towel on the counter because she had read somewhere that color in a kitchen made a difference, and she had believed this and had acted on it, and it had made a difference, and that had seemed to her, on that first evening, like evidence of something worth knowing. They had been happy there, in the particular way of young couples who are building something from almost nothing and who find the building itself to be a source of satisfaction. They did not have extra money. Extra money was not a concept that applied to their lives in those years. But they had enough, and enough, Eleanor had come to believe over a lifetime of calibrating it, was not a diminished version of more. Enough was its own thing, and it had a dignity that more did not always have. Robert was born in the spring of 1968, and the one-bedroom apartment on Callaway Street became, by the arithmetic of a baby's presence, no longer sufficient. They found a two-bedroom on the other side of Lexington, on a street with old trees and a sidewalk wide enough for a stroller, and the rent was $54 a month, which required a recalibration of everything. And they recalibrated without complaint because Robert was there and Robert was the reason. Eleanor had gone back to work 8 weeks after he was born, leaving him with a neighbor woman named Mrs. Pickett who charged $3 a day and who held babies with the comfortable authority of someone who had raised 4 of her own. The $3 a day was added to the accounting, and the accounting was adjusted, and they managed, which was what they did. Thomas had proposed in 1972 that they look into buying. He had said it carefully, the way he said things he had been thinking about for a while, at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the coffee between them and Robert playing on the floor with a set of wooden blocks Eleanor's mother had sent from Harlan County. He had pulled out a piece of paper on which he had done the calculations, mortgage rates and down payment requirements, and what their combined income could support based on the lending standards of the time. The numbers were close. Not impossible, but close. They had talked about it through 2 cups of coffee and arrived at the conclusion that the down payment was not yet there, and that waiting another 2 years would put them in a stronger position. 2 years became 4 when the roads department had a round of layoffs that spared Thomas, but reduced his overtime significantly. 4 became 7 when Eleanor's father became ill, and they spent 2 years sending money to Harlan County every month to help her mother manage. 7 became 11 when the building they were renting decided to convert to condominiums, and they had to move again, quickly, into a place they had not chosen carefully, at a rent that had risen with the market in ways that reset their calculations from the beginning. Eleanor did not speak bitterly about any of this. She was not a bitter woman. She had watched bitterness operate in other people over the years, and had observed that it was expensive, that it cost more than it returned, and she had made a practical decision against it the way she made practical decisions about most things. Life had not been cruel to her. Life had been complicated, which was different. Complicated meant there were problems with solutions, and solutions required patience and method, and patience and method were things she had in supply. What she also had through all of it was the envelope. She had started in 1978, the year Robert had turned 10, and the year she had first allowed herself to think concretely about what the house, when it came, would actually look like. The first item she had placed in it was a photograph cut from a home magazine in the waiting room of Robert's pediatrician's office. A small house with a covered front porch and a climbing rose along the left side, and a garden that was clearly the work of someone who loved it. She had folded it carefully and placed it in the envelope and put the envelope in the bottom drawer. And that had been the beginning. The envelope grew slowly, the way things grow when they are tended without urgency, but also without neglect. Eleanor added to it the way she added to her savings account, not in large dramatic gestures, but in small consistent deposits that accumulated over time into something that had weight and substance. A photograph here, a printed listing there, a page torn carefully from a magazine in the break room at the distribution center, when no one was looking, folded twice and tucked into her jacket pocket and transferred to the envelope that evening when she got home. Over 22 years, the envelope had become thick enough that it no longer closed flat, and she had secured it with a rubber band that she replaced every few years when the old one dried out and snapped. The houses inside it were not all the same. Eleanor had not been looking for one specific thing. She had been looking for a feeling, and the feeling was harder to define than a list of features. It was something about the relationship between the house and the land around it. The way a house sat in its garden. The way a front porch suggested that the person who lived there was not in a hurry, that they had made a place for themselves in the world and were content to occupy it fully rather than passing through it on the way to somewhere else. She could not have explained this to anyone in precise terms, but she knew it when she saw in a photograph, a kind of settled quality, a rightness, the look of a house that had found its people, and its people had found it. There was a stone cottage she had torn from a gardening magazine in 1981, somewhere in rural Tennessee, with a dry stack stone wall along the front boundary and a kitchen garden visible through the gate. She had looked at that photograph so many times over the years that the paper had softened at the fold lines, and the image had the slightly worn quality of something that had been handled with regularity and care. There was a farmhouse listing she had printed from a real estate website in 2004 in eastern Kentucky, with a wraparound porch and a barn at the back of the property, and a price that had been within reach until the month she printed it, when a series of unexpected expenses had pushed the reaching back by another year. There was a small white house with green shutters that she had photographed herself from the passenger window of Robert's car on a drive through a town called Millbrook in 2011 on the way back from a Thanksgiving visit. She had not had a proper camera and had used her phone, and the image was slightly blurred from the motion of the car, but the house was clear enough, the green shutters and the window boxes and the late November light on the front garden, and she had printed it when she got home and added it to the envelope without explanation because no explanation was needed. The envelope understood. Robert knew about the envelope. She had shown it to him once, in 2009, on a Sunday visit when he and Dana had driven down from Columbus, and they had sat at her kitchen table after dinner with the contents spread out between them. Robert had gone through the photographs quietly, with the attention of someone who was looking at something important, and when he had finished, he had looked at his mother across the table with an expression she recognized as the one he got when something mattered more than he was going to say out loud. "You're going to get there," he had said. She had put her hand briefly over his and said, "I know," and she had meant it, which was the thing about the envelope. It was not a record of longing. It was a record of certainty. She had always believed it would happen. The envelope was the proof that she had never stopped believing, even in the years when believing required the most effort. She had thought about the house on Sunday mornings, which had been her and Thomas's time for it when he was alive, and which she had continued alone after he was gone because the habit was too much a part of Sunday to abandon. She would drive, when the weather was good, through neighborhoods she found appealing, the established ones with the old trees, and the houses that had been lived in long enough to show it in the way good houses show it, not in disrepair, but in settledness, the garden that has been tended for 20 years, the porch furniture that matches because someone chose it for a specific place and not just for a general idea of sitting outside. She drove slowly through these neighborhoods and looked and did not feel envious exactly, because envy required believing that what you wanted belonged to someone else and not also to you, and Eleanor had never believed that. She had believed that the house she was looking for was somewhere, waiting, and that she would find it when the time was right. She thought about the kitchen window. Every house in the envelope had a kitchen window that let in morning light, and this was not coincidence. She had noticed it in herself gradually, and then all at once, the way you notice patterns once you're looking for them. The morning light in a kitchen was not decorative. It was functional in a way that went beyond illumination. It was the thing that made the first hour of the day feel like an opening rather than an obligation. And Eleanor, who had risen at 5:30 every working morning for 34 years to be on her route by 6, had a particular and informed relationship with the first hour of the day and what it required to be faced well. She thought about having Robert and Dana to stay, and the grandchildren, 2 of them now, a boy of 9 named Marcus and a girl of 6 named Lily, who called her Grandma Ellie, and who had never known a version of her that had a garden or a porch or a house with a deed that had her name on it. She wanted them to know that version. She wanted Marcus and Lily to come in the summers and learn the names of the flowers and help her in the kitchen garden and sleep in a room she had prepared for them specifically, not a converted office with a fold-out sofa, but a proper room with proper beds and a window that looked out onto something worth waking up to see. This was not fantasy. Eleanor was not a woman who fantasized. These were plans, held in patience, waiting for the conditions that would allow them to be executed. And in the spring of the year she turned 79, the conditions finally arrived. The number came together on a Wednesday morning in March, the kind of March morning in Kentucky that cannot decide whether it belongs to winter or spring and settles for both simultaneously, cold in the shade and tentatively warm in the sun, the light having that particular quality of early spring that makes everything look freshly arrived. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with her notebook and her coffee when she finished the calculation and sat back and looked at what she had written. The pension from the Postal Service, which she had been drawing for 11 years. The Social Security, which she had deferred until 72 because the difference in the monthly amount had been worth the waiting, and she had always been willing to wait when the mathematics justified it. The savings account, maintained through decades of the same monthly discipline, through the years of reduced income and unexpected expenses and the cost of being a person in the world without a second salary to share the weight. The proceeds from selling the contents of 11 years of apartment living. The furniture she would not be taking, the second car she no longer needed, the accumulated objects of a careful and organized life that she had sorted through with the unsentimental efficiency she brought to necessary tasks. Added together, on a Wednesday morning in March, they made the number. Not a large number by the standards of people who had been accumulating property their whole lives. Everything she had. She sat with it for a long moment, the coffee going slightly cold in her hands, and she felt something she did not try to name because naming it felt like it might disturb it. It was the feeling of an arrival, not at the house. She did not have the house yet, but at the place where the house became possible, which was a place she had been walking toward for so long that reaching it felt less like a destination than like a recognition. Of course, this is where the road came out. She had always known it came out somewhere. She called Robert that evening. He was quiet for a moment when she told him, the particular quiet of someone absorbing news they have been hoping for on behalf of someone they love. Then he said, "Mom, that's it. That's a number." And she said, "Yes, that's the number." And he said, "Okay." And she could hear in the okay everything he was not saying, which was considerable and did not need to be said. They talked for 40 minutes about next steps, about what she should look for and what she should avoid and how the process worked. And Robert offered to come down and help her search. And she thanked him and said she would let him know, and she meant it, and they both understood that she was going to begin looking on her own because beginning on her own was how she did things. She had been looking at listings for 2 weeks when she found the cottage in Crestwood. It appeared on a Tuesday morning in early April. In the results of search, she had set up to notify her of new listings within her price range in small towns within a 2-hour drive of Lexington. The town of Crestwood, Kentucky, was one she knew slightly, having passed through it twice on drives through the region, a quiet town with a main street that still had the proportions of a place that had been built for people rather than cars, old brick storefronts and wide sidewalks, and the kind of unhurried quality that suggested the people who lived there had made a considered choice to be there. The listing was from a realty company called Dwyer Property Group, operated by a man named Martin Dwyer, whose photograph on the company website showed a man in his mid-50s with the practiced smile of someone who had learned that confidence was a product you sold alongside the property. The listing described the property as a historic cottage with original character, established mature gardens, and the timeless charm of a home that has been part of the Crestwood community for generations. The price was at the very edge of her range, which was not comfortable but was not impossible. The photographs were 11 in number, taken in what appeared to be late afternoon light that turned everything it touched to gold. The cottage itself was barely visible in most of them. It was covered, from the foundation to the roofline and beyond, in a dense cascade of vines so thick and so thoroughly established that the house beneath them was more suggestion than structure. Where the facade was partially visible between the growth, it had the warm and weathered quality of old wood that had been in the same place for a very long time, which was precisely the quality Eleanor had been looking for in the pages of the envelope for 22 years. The garden, in the background of several images, appeared lush and established, the kind of garden that had been tended and loved and left to develop its own character over decades. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she sent the listing to Robert with a single line. "I think this might be it." Robert called back in 6 minutes. He looked at the photographs, and he said the things a careful son says, that it looked beautiful, that they should arrange a visit before making any decisions, that there was no rush, that the right house would still be available when they had done the proper due diligence. Eleanor listened to all of it and agreed with all of it in the way she agreed with sensible advice that she had already decided to move past. Martin Dwyer answered her call on the second ring. Martin Dwyer had the voice of a man who had spent a long time making other people feel that they were in capable hands. It was unhurried and specific and warm in the practiced way of someone who understood that warmth was a professional instrument as much as a personal quality. He knew the property thoroughly, or presented himself as knowing it, which in Eleanor's experience amounted to the same thing during a phone call with a stranger. He described the cottage with the fluency of someone who had walked its rooms and stood in its garden and understood its particular appeal. The vine growth, he explained, was what gave the property its name locally. People in Crestwood had called it the Vine Cottage for as long as anyone could remember. The gardens were established in the way that only decades of careful tending could produce. The original construction dated to the late 1800s, which accounted for the quality of the bones, the foundation, the framing, the materials used in an era when materials were chosen to endure rather than to meet a budget. He mentioned, with the casual ease of a man introducing an obvious fact, that there had been considerable interest. Several parties had already expressed serious intent. A property with this kind of character at this price point in a market that was appreciating as steadily as the Crestwood market was currently appreciating did not remain available for long. He said this without urgency, in the tone of someone sharing useful information rather than applying pressure, which Eleanor recognized as a more sophisticated form of pressure than the obvious kind. She asked about visiting the property. Martin explained that the sellers were currently managing an estate situation that had them out of the state, and that the property was between caretaking arrangements, which made scheduling a visit in the immediate term complicated. He could certainly arrange something in the coming weeks, he said, if she was willing to wait. The coming weeks, he added, might present a different availability picture given the interest level. He said it regretfully, as though the market's behavior was something he personally wished he could change on her behalf. Eleanor had been patient for 61 years. She was not unacquainted with waiting. But she was 79 years old, and she had the number, and she had the photographs, and she had the feeling she had learned over 22 years of looking to trust when it arrived, the feeling that this was the one. She called Robert that evening, and they talked for an hour. Robert was cautious in the measured way of a son who loves his mother and is trying to protect her without overstepping the boundary of her autonomy, which he had learned over the years was a boundary she maintained with quiet firmness. He said they should not sign anything without a proper inspection. He said the photographs were beautiful, but photographs were not visits. He said he would drive down that weekend, and they could call Martin Dwyer together and push harder on the viewing arrangement. Eleanor agreed to all of this and meant it. Then she lay awake that night and looked at the photographs on her tablet. The vine-covered facade in the afternoon light, the suggestion of a window frame visible beneath a curtain of green, the garden path disappearing into the established growth. And she thought about the envelope and the 22 years and the stone cottage in Tennessee and the farmhouse listing from 2004 and the green-shuttered house she had photographed from Robert's car window in Millbrook. She thought about Thomas, who had sat with her at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in 1972 with his careful calculations and his quiet certainty that the house was coming. She thought about all the first of the months, all the rent payments, all the landlords and leases and moves, and the particular feeling of living in a place that could be taken back. She called Martin Dwyer the next morning before Robert had woken up in Columbus. She made an offer at the listed price. Martin said he would present it immediately and that given the interest level, he was cautiously optimistic. He called back in 3 hours to say the sellers had accepted. The paperwork arrived electronically that afternoon. 17 pages of dense contractual language that Eleanor read carefully at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and a second cup of coffee, understanding most of it and trusting, in the places where the language became technical and opaque, that it said what Martin had told her it said during the 90-minute video call in which he walked her through each clause with patient and reassuring explanation. She called Robert after she had signed. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for her to understand what it contained. "Mom," he said, "we were going to look at it first." "I know," she said. She said it without apology because she had none to offer. She had been looking for 61 years, and she was done waiting. Robert was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Okay." He said it the way people say okay when they love someone too much to say anything else. The money transferred on Friday. By Friday afternoon, Eleanor Burrows was a homeowner for the first time in her life. She wept at the kitchen table when the confirmation email arrived. Not from sadness, from the weight of finally. Eleanor drove to Crestwood on a Saturday morning in late April, alone, which Robert had argued against, and which she had insisted upon with the quiet finality she brought to decisions she had already made. He had offered to drive down from Columbus and make the trip with her, and she had thanked him and told him she needed to do this particular part by herself, the first arrival at her own house, the first time she would turn a key in a lock that belonged to her. He had understood, or had accepted, which in Eleanor's experience amounted to the same thing when the person accepting was doing so out of love. She had the listing photographs printed and on the passenger seat beside her for part of the drive, which she was aware was not a practical thing to have done, but which she had done anyway. She had looked at them so many times in the 3 weeks since the purchase that she could have reconstructed each one from memory. The particular quality of the afternoon light on the vine-covered facade, the suggestion of the garden path beneath the growth, the warm weathered wood visible in the gaps between the green. She had the envelope with her as well, in her bag on the back seat, because it had accompanied every significant moment of this journey, and it seemed wrong to leave it behind for this one. She turned on a Sycamore Lane in Crestwood at 10:15 in the morning. The street had the established quality she had hoped for. Old trees with root systems that had lifted portions of the sidewalk into gentle undulations. Modest houses that had been lived in long enough to show it in the good ways. Front gardens tended with the personal investment of people who intended to stay. She slowed as she approached the address Martin had given her, reading the numbers on the mailboxes, and then she saw it. The cottage was recognizable from the photographs in the way that something is recognizable when the photographs were taken under conditions designed to conceal rather than reveal. The vines were there, certainly. More than there. They had advanced significantly beyond what the images had suggested, covering not just the facade, but the entire visible surface of the structure, climbing past the roofline and reaching along both sides in tendrils that had found their way under the eaves and around the window frames, and in every gap the old construction offered. The house beneath them was not visible. It was not partially visible. It was entirely consumed, a shape inside a growth, a structure that had been overtaken so thoroughly that it existed now as an interruption in the vegetation rather than a thing the vegetation grew upon. Eleanor stopped the car and sat looking at it without moving for a long moment. The garden path in the photographs was invisible beneath a season of uncut growth that had spread across it entirely. The front boundary had been overtaken by shrubs that had not been managed in what appeared to be several years, their branches crossing and tangling in the way of things that had been left to compete without intervention. The gate, when she eventually got out of the car and walked to it, was rusted at the hinges in a way that suggested it had not been opened with any regularity for a considerable time. She pushed the gate open with effort and found the path beneath the growth by feel as much as by sight, testing each step on stones that had shifted and sunk unevenly beneath years of neglect. The smell reached her before she was halfway to the door, damp and enclosed, the smell of a place that had been sealed against fresh air for too long, with something older and less identifiable underneath it. She found the door under a particularly dense curtain of vines and inserted the key Martin had sent by courier the previous week. The lock turned stiffly. She pushed the door open. The interior was dim in a way that went beyond the absence of switched-on lights. The windows were so completely covered by the vine growth outside that almost no natural light penetrated, and it took her eyes a full minute to adjust to the dimness. When they did, what she saw confirmed what the smell had been preparing her for. The ceiling of the front room carried a water stain that spread across nearly its entire surface. The dark, concentrated rings of repeated leaking that had occurred over years and had never been addressed. The walls had the distinctive gray-black patterning of mold that had been left to establish and expand without intervention. The floorboards, which she could see were original and had once been beautiful, had been subjected to enough moisture over enough time that they moved softly underfoot in the way that wood moves when its structural integrity has been compromised. She stood in the dim front room of her house, and she looked at what she had bought with everything she had, and she felt the distance between the photographs and the reality as a physical thing, a weight that settled across her shoulders and did not lift. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She drove to a hardware store she had passed on the way into Crestwood and bought a lantern and a notebook and a pen. Then she drove back to the cottage and went inside again. She sat on the front step with the lantern on and the notebook open on her knee, and she began to write down what she could see and what it meant and what would need to happen. She filled 4 pages before the light outside began to change. Then she closed the notebook and sat for a while longer in the quiet of the garden, among the overgrown shrubs and the uncut growth, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was in, not to wallow in it. Eleanor Burrows did not wallow, but because she had learned over 79 years that the only way through a hard thing was to look at it directly and completely before you decided what to do about it. She was still sitting there when a voice came from the direction of the gate. The voice belonged to a woman named Dorothy Aldridge, who lived 2 houses down on Sycamore Lane and who had, as she explained without embarrassment, been watching from her front porch since the unfamiliar car had parked outside the cottage that morning. Dorothy was 74 years old, small and precise in her movements, with white hair, cut short and practical, and the direct manner of someone who had long ago decided that life was too brief for conversational inefficiency. She had brought nothing with her, no pie, no casserole, none of the traditional instruments of neighborly introduction, because she had read the situation correctly from her porch and understood that what was needed was not food but information, and information was something she had in considerable supply. She had lived on Sycamore Lane for 27 years. She knew the history of every property on it the way long-term residents accumulate knowledge, not from documents or official records, but from the slow and attentive accumulation of having been present. She sat down on the low stone wall that bordered the cottage's front path with the careful deliberateness of a 74-year-old who had learned not to rush the sitting down part, and she looked at Eleanor with the frank appraisal of someone deciding how much to say. "You bought it," Dorothy said. It was not a question. Eleanor said she had. Dorothy looked at the cottage for a moment. "Martin Dwyer," she said. Eleanor said yes. Dorothy's expression shifted in a specific way. Not surprise, but the confirmation of something she had already suspected. "I was afraid it might be him," she said. She said it the way you say a name you have been waiting to hear, connected to a particular kind of story. She told Eleanor what she knew. The cottage had been built in the 1880s by a man named Cornelius Prath, an architect and landowner who had designed several structures in the region during that period and who had accumulated parcels of land across the county with the methodical intent of a man who believed that land was the most permanent form of security available to a person. Prath had died in 1929 without direct heirs, his family having preceded him, and the property had passed through several owners in the decades that followed. The last owner had vacated 4 years ago under circumstances Dorothy described as abrupt and unexplained, and the cottage had stood empty since. The county had condemned it within 18 months of it being vacated, when a routine inspection had identified structural deficiencies that the years of deferred maintenance and the advancing vine growth had created and concealed simultaneously. Eleanor listened to all of this with the focused stillness she brought to information that required absorbing rather than merely hearing. Then she asked the question that had been forming since Dorothy had sat down. "The condemnation," she said. "It would have been a matter of public record." Dorothy said yes. Any realtor representing the property would have been legally required to know about it and to disclose it. The notice had been posted on the property itself. She added, though she acknowledged it had been covered by the vine growth within months of going up, which was the kind of coincidence that was difficult to regard as coincidental. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. Then she asked Dorothy about the structural situation, about whether anything about the cottage was salvageable, whether the foundation was sound, whether there was anything beneath the damage worth preserving. Dorothy said she did not know the technical details, but that she knew someone who might know something more useful than that. She said it with the deliberate quality of a person who has been waiting for the right moment to say a specific thing. She said that Cornelius Prath, the original builder, had been known in the region for 2 things. The first was the quality of his foundations, which had outlasted the structures built upon them in several cases. The second was more unusual. Prath had had a practice, documented in the Regional Historical Society records that Dorothy had read with the thoroughness of a woman who spent her retirement afternoons in the local library, of placing important documents within the walls of his structures rather than entrusting them to banks or legal institutions, which he had distrusted on the basis of personal experience with financial instability in the years surrounding the Panic of 1907. He had built secured cavities into several of his properties, spaces between the interior and exterior walls, reinforced and sealed, intended to preserve documents against fire and flood and the general unreliability of human institutions. Eleanor looked at the cottage. She looked at the vines covering it and the crack that had appeared along the left side of the facade where the growth had pulled at the old mortar and the wall had shifted in response. She looked at Dorothy. "Are you telling me," she said carefully, "that there might be something inside that wall?" Dorothy looked back at her with the expression of someone who has delivered the most important sentence of a conversation and is now waiting to see what the other person does with it. "I'm telling you," Dorothy said, "that before you call an attorney and before you call anyone else, it might be worth finding out." They moved through the condemned structure carefully, with the awareness of people who understood that the floor beneath them had opinions about its remaining useful life, and that those opinions deserved respect. The crack along the left wall of the front room had opened enough to reveal the interior cavity of the wall, the space between the interior plaster and the exterior cladding, which in a structure of this age and construction method was a substantial gap. Dorothy held the flashlight to the opening. Eleanor leaned in and looked. There, set into a bracket that had been built directly into the wall framing, was a metal box approximately the size of a large book. It had a handle and a keyhole and the dark patina of very old metal, and it was entirely intact, protected by the sealed cavity from the moisture damage that had reached everything else in the structure. Eleanor reached in and took hold of the handle. The box did not move. It was bolted to the bracket, secured with hardware that had been set in place nearly 140 years ago and had no intention of releasing without argument. Eleanor looked at Dorothy. Then she went to her car and came back with the small toolkit she kept in the trunk, a habit from 34 years of being a mail carrier who understood that a vehicle was only as reliable as the preparation you brought to it. And she worked at the bracket bolts for 35 minutes with the patient determination of a woman who had been waiting for things her whole life and knew how to wait productively. The box came free at 2:15 in the afternoon. The emails kept coming through April and into May, and Gloria read every one of them at the small desk she had built from salvaged lumber and positioned beneath the parlor window that faced east. They came from everywhere. A woman in Chattanooga who had inherited a deteriorating Victorian and didn't know where to begin. A recently divorced woman from Memphis with a background in interior design looking for something meaningful to redirect it toward. A preservation student at the University of Tennessee who wanted to know if Gloria would consider taking on an intern. And 3 separate individuals who asked, in varying degrees of directness, whether Gloria had considered teaching. She had not, or rather, she had not permitted herself to consider it, in a way that people who have spent decades being told implicitly that their knowledge is secondary learn not to consider the possibility that it might be worth passing on. But Arthur, when she showed him the emails on one of his regular visits, read through them carefully and said simply, "This is what happens when people see real knowledge applied to real work. What are you going to do?" Gloria thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she called Brenda, Dr. Park, and Arthur and asked if they would help her develop structured weekend workshops on historic preservation methodology, with the Calder Roadhouse as the living classroom. All 3 said yes without hesitation. The first workshop ran on a Saturday in June. Gloria had expected 6 or 8 people. 19 registered. They came from across Tennessee and 2 from neighboring states. They ranged in age from 31 to 74. Old house owners, recently retired professionals, people who had simply read about what Gloria was doing and wanted to understand how it was possible. Gloria taught them for 2 days, taking them through every room, explaining what she had found, what it meant, and what she had done to preserve it. She discovered with some surprise, a natural teacher, clear, precise, and possessed of the particular authority that comes not from credentials but from having actually done the thing being taught. It was in September that Simone came. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon with Gloria's granddaughter Priya, who was 13 and had been asking about the house since reading about it online. Gloria was pruning overgrowth from the eastern foundation wall when they pulled up. She straightened and looked at her daughter across the yard, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Priya broke the silence. "Is that the original foundation? Hamlet, right?" Gloria looked at her granddaughter with surprise. "How do you know that?" "I read the magazine article," Priya said, "and then I found your name in the preservation office database." I want to see everything. Gloria looked at Simone, who stood with the full weight of 2 years of silence on her face. I chose Dad's approval over being your daughter, Simone said quietly. I'm ashamed of it. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking if there's a way forward. Gloria considered her for a long moment. Come see the house, she said. Marcus never called. Some distances are chosen in ways that can't be unchosen by the person left behind, and the only dignified response is to stop waiting and direct your energy toward what is present and worth tending. Frank remarried Tanya, and Gloria received the news with complete neutrality. He belonged to a finished chapter. She felt, when she thought about him at all, the mild recognition one feels toward a place one used to live, memory without longing. By the time the Calder Road house was fully restored, 2 years and 4 months after Gloria had first unlocked the front door, it had been assessed at $290,000 and designated a contributing property to a newly established historic district. The total out-of-pocket cost, net of grants and credits, had been approximately $34,000 beyond the purchase price, less than the divorce settlement Frank had called generous. On the 3rd anniversary of her purchase, Gloria stood in the restored parlor with Arthur, Brenda, Dr. Park, and 14 women from her workshop program, watching afternoon light move through the original wavy glass of the front windows. She thought about her father teaching her to read old buildings the way others taught their daughters to read music. She thought about the graduate program acceptance letter 40 years in the past. She thought about everything she had set aside and everything she had recovered and everything she now understood about the relationship between loss and discovery. Second chances do not announce themselves. They arrive disguised as disasters, as locked doors on properties nobody else wanted. They require the specific, accumulated knowledge you have been carrying and used for decades and believed was no longer relevant. It is always relevant. It does not expire. She was 66 years old and exactly where she was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.